Hi, everybody. Oh, that's a little hot. Do you know we've done almost 12 of these? Yeah. So, thanks for staying with me. Tonight's going to get weird. Are you sure you're ready for it? Like, truly. Like, it might get a little uncomfortable. I promise I don't go too in detail into these things, but we have to cover a lot of these topics because, from what I can tell, they're just not covered very often. And they're the questions that we get the most at RC from folks who are deconstructing, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, okay? All right. Welcome to Rancho Christi Community Night, where we take a breather from the rigmarole of everyday life, settle down for a minute, and take some deep dives into Christian theology and how to apply it in our specific society. This is a space where we dedicate our hearts and our minds to considering what the Bible has to say on topics that are not necessarily welcomed or discussed widely in our culture. The material we're going to consider is normally somewhat controversial, but that's not because we're seeking to be controversial at all. It's rather just what happens when real issues are discussed and clarified. What happens is that ideally, the truth prevails. And truth very often can be quite painful to deal with, but it can also be liberating. And it's inside of this tension that we desire to dwell, in the gap. Where there is the most intellectual heartache, the biggest concerns, doubts, fears, and in some cases purposeful avoidance of material, where we must contend as the body of Christ. And contend with it we will. Because for a great deal of individuals in this era in particular, it's in the rawness of sorting these theological details that is where their liberation from that grief is found. Deconstruction. That is our overarching theme for this next round of your regularly scheduled public apologetics nights here at RC. Part of my job as your friendly neighborhood apologist is to look out over our community and what's happening and attempt to gauge what's needed for us specifically. And with the amount of church leaders, celebrities, and those who follow them on social media, the issue in particular is reaching numbers that I cannot responsibly ignore for us. So for the first time in living memory, the majority of people in Great Britain recently reported that they believed there was no God. The land of Tolkien, Lewis, Chesterton, and Stott has been replaced by a landscape of faithlessness. So too here in the U.S. We are watching scores of individuals disavow their religious heritage in the form of deconstruction, a sort of mid-faith crisis of sorts. As someone recently put it, the title Deconstructing Christian means that whatever they previously affirmed in Christianity is beginning to unravel, and at a rate that is exponential. Normally, this begins as a doctrinal disagreement, something small, something easily overlooked. But that disagreement begins snowballing, and suddenly what was just one question has become so many questions that they're overwhelmed, and that the only thing they can do is suffer isolated in their own minds, hiding from their loved ones that they're no longer Christians as far as they can tell. Or they can find solace in posting their agony on social media for the litany of strangers already prepared to give their approval to their rejection of this so-called unenlightened myth religion. And inevitably, because it really doesn't matter which of these paths they choose, the destination is exactly the same. They don't want to go backward. They want to go forward into the liberation of truth. And since where they came from was a life that included being churched, that must mean that there is no church ahead of them. And it's here that I would like to suggest we begin to orient our thoughts on this topic. Meaning that the content that the church must respond to in this particular stage of human history is a culture that has lost the ability to discern responsibly between what someone claims is Christianity and what the Bible physically says is Christianity. I'm generalizing the problem here, so let me paint a picture. The folks who are deconstructing as adults are the kids that were raised under the assumption that what made them a Christian was the environment around them, their family members, their attendance in youth group, their consequent pursuit of ministry-oriented vocation, etc. They don't have any personal exposure to what life looks like outside of an environment framed in Christianish vocabulary. And therefore, it is reasonable for them to assume, because they have no knowledge, that it's an assumption at all. That process of disillusionment with the Christianish things around them is naturally and sincerely arrived at. They simply don't realize that those things are actually assumptions until something comes and jars them internally. The death of a friend, a failed marriage, the suspicion that their life is without purpose, inexplicable suffering of a family member, experiencing abuse from someone who claims to be a Christian, the failure of their home church to address topics that they see as important, etc. And it's in that place that they turn around for something concrete to anchor themselves to and realize that not only do they not have it, but also that they're not even certain what concrete looks like, even if they did. And so they're drowning now, and all of the tools they have to get out of the water are at their fingertips, but they've never seen or practiced using them, and panic is setting in. Deconstruction is not ignorance. This is not a process that Christians should dismiss as simply biblical illiteracy or a failure to understand apologetic method. That's part of it, yes. But it would be too imprecise to call that the frame by which we are to understand our loved ones going through this process, meaning that the prescription for a deconstructing Christian is not to blow by blow slap them across the face with Bible verses that they should already know. It's not to shame them into feeling like they should know better. It's not to suggest that the reason everything is upside down for them is because they just secretly want to pursue sin and not be called out about it. And it's not to desperately try to keep them from the process of deconstructing their faith. Why? Well, because I'd like to suggest to you this evening that deconstruction is a panic attack of the soul. There is a protocol here that is different than raw education. A desire to be disobedient may be a part of this process, but there is a level of pain here that must be addressed before we correct flawed theology, and we cannot dismiss what is happening as purely sin or purely ignorance. This kind is different. Let me illustrate this with an example. Years ago now, a young woman came to one of our campus events. I had partnered with Frank Turek to invite the students and faculty into an event entitled "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," which was designed to hit at the heart of what was really being discussed when we talk about faith in Christianity versus the blind faith that the new atheist movement continually misrepresented Christianity as. Over 16,000 attended via the live stream, and somewhere around 400 or so folks showed up in person, and this young woman was one of them. What was striking about her, though, as she approached the mic to ask her question, was that she was visibly shaking, and it wasn't from nerves. She was angry. And as she introduced her question for us, she began by saying that she had grown up in church, graduated from one of our local four-year Bible colleges with the intention of going into ministry, but that after she graduated, she was exposed to a life in general outside of school. It wasn't what she was expecting, and that after some of her very serious prayers were not answered, she realized that maybe God wasn't there after all, or at the very least, he didn't care. But none of this was the surprising part. The surprising part was that all this led up to this question. If what you are saying is true about the evidence for Christianity, then why was it hidden from me? She had been given 3 hours worth of apologetics content focused intentionally on answering the generic objections secular humanism raises against the church. Centuries of well-worn theological exposition, nothing new. Between my guest host and I, there was not a single unique thought expressed that hadn't been communicated already in the history of Christian thought. And the result for her being exposed to our presentation was not, oh wow, that was edifying. The result was that she was livid. And her conclusions after speaking with me at length was that she did not believe it was possible for her to have lived inside of a Christian environment for that long and to have never been voluntarily shown this content before. Therefore, I must be a liar. I must be making it all up. For her, deconstruction was the only way to make sense of our community, this community, our community. She had been told her entire life what Christianity was and was not. She then encountered others who also wore the label Christian who disagreed. She then rightly referenced negative things she had experienced under the umbrella term Christian, followed by beseeching God for something he was not ready to give her, accelerated by a myriad of assumptions stemming from an education in Bible college where she assumed that it was here that she would be schooled in everything Christianity had to offer, the result of which was the very rational conclusion: I can't make heads or tails of any of this. No one else can either. And the thing I have been taught will confirm God's presence in my life has failed. Therefore, the entire thing is a sham. She was being extremely reasonable. She was being rational. But her rationale was incomplete, and the reason that none of my heady apologetics capabilities were making any headway whatsoever was that I was viewing her as in need of raw education. Just the facts. But I was dead wrong. And I was effectively failing her because I saw her as needing spiritual medicine for a spiritual ailment. But she wasn't sick. She was having a spiritual panic attack. Have you ever had a panic attack? They're terrifying. They typically begin without warning, very sudden, and they can strike at any time. Normally, the first one comes during a time of excessive stress in the life of the individual experiencing it. And it seems that temperament plays a role in how often someone has one. For example, if you're genetically prone to negative emotion or have a higher sensitivity to stress, the likelihood you will have one at least once in your lifetime climbs. But at the end of the day, modern medicine really doesn't have a firm understanding of why they occur at all, just that they occur. They feel like you're going to die and that this death is imminent. The natural course of adrenaline through your body occurs, putting you in fight or flight mode. The problem, though, is that in so doing, your brain's instinct to scan your environment for the danger comes back with the message, there is no danger, so why are you reacting this way? The resulting conclusion is that you're going insane. The resulting rational panic that feeds back into the loop, feeding the original problem, and on down the road this goes. Every loop exponentially becoming worse, feeding the physiological symptoms of panic. Pounding heart rate, trembling, shortness of breath, and a tightening of one's throat. Hot flashes, nausea, abdominal cramping, dizziness, loss of peripheral vision, and a sense of detachment from reality. And if you've ever experienced one, you know that list goes on. If you have a loved one that experiences these regularly, you know that the only thing that you can do is help them by doing grounding exercises. What grounding exercises do is attempt to arrest that positive feedback loop. You do not address the symptoms at all. And whatever you do, you never want to respond to them by saying, calm down. Because they aren't in control of what's happening, and that makes the loop worse. What you do is ground them by having them sit or lie down. You help them focus on regulating their breathing, affirming that they are experiencing something real that will ease momentarily. But as everyone who's experienced one knows, myself included, the real problem is not that you've had a panic attack. The real problem is that you fear having another one. And so the only thing left to do that makes any sense, since we don't know what triggered it to begin with, is to avoid whatever environment you were in when the panic attack first set in. And when, if you have these things repeated, you go to therapy later for treatment, you will be exposed to what is called cognitive behavioral therapy, where the therapist will help you gradually recreate the symptoms of the panic attack in a safe, repetitive manner. And once those sensations of panic no longer feel threatening because you have desensitized yourself to them through exposure and practice, the attacks will begin to resolve. And if successful, the treatment ultimately makes you stronger because you now can handle the environments you couldn't before, and you no longer need anyone's help to do so. Therapy's ultimate end is to make you not need therapy anymore because you're your own therapist, and you can identify what would be therapeutic for you in the future. I would like to suggest to you tonight that deconstruction is actually a panic attack on a spiritual level, and that the reason we should not respond to deconstructing Christians with pure apologetics, and what I mean by this is pure theological correction and argumentation, is because to do so is to completely misdiagnose the problem. They don't need to be corrected first. They need spiritual grounding exercises first. And they need people around them who can identify that they need spiritual grounding exercises and help them do that. The natural result of grounding will be that they understand the next step of spiritual cognitive behavioral therapy, that is pure apologetics, is making them stronger. It's not attacking them. It's coming alongside of them and strengthening their spirit. They'll be able to practice apologetics as therapy and know that it's for their edification. In so doing, what they will be building is a healthy reconstruction of the very environment that they are trying to avoid for fear of another attack, the church. Well, what do you mean when you communicate all this, Anna? Well, I mean to communicate that simply saying to a deconstructing Christian that they need to get back to church feels like banging your head against a wall because you actually are banging your head against a wall. I mean to communicate that the grief you feel watching your loved one disavow Christianity may be the very thing that must occur in order for them to become real Christians. And I mean to say that in that grief is a chance for us to do for them precisely what we know rightly they need. The church. It's just that the church looks different for those who are deconstructing. The church for them is no longer to be assumed to be an environment. The church for them is you. And so we must be well trained in spiritual grounding exercises. And we must view ourselves as speaking to individuals going through panic attacks. So that is what we're going to do tonight, right? I am going to teach you some grounding exercises. If you are currently deconstructing or have deconstructed already, hello, I'm glad you made it. You're in a safe environment, and I have every intention to keep it that way. If you are a Christian and you are here to observe, well, then settle in, because you're about to have a crash course in seminary level hermeneutics, and I will explain what that means momentarily. And if you are a family member here tonight trying to understand what your loved one is going through and how to respond, you're about to be given several tools to get you started. I've picked out segments of the Bible that have been repeatedly brought up to me by folks deconstructing as what came to their minds as examples of what got them concerned. And I have selected a passage of Scripture that I know without a shadow of a doubt our church and our community will be dealing with on this level in the immediate future. How do I know? Because it's already happening, and local pastors are picking up on the problem and already putting out podcasts attempting to shut down discussion of this content. So I might as well put out a podcast too. So for clarity, I am taking you through real-world exercises while simultaneously teaching you grounding techniques. Got it? All right, let's dive in. Genesis 30, 14 through 18, the mandrake incident. If you are not familiar with this story, then here's the context. Jacob, of the famous Jacob and Esau twins, has manipulated and willfully deceived his own dying father, stolen his brother's birthright. He's fled to his uncle's house to avoid the potential rage murder his brother is plotting, having discovered said betrayal. He then negotiates a work contract with his lying uncle, Laban, who claims that he can marry his youngest daughter, Rachel, who Jacob is already in love with, if he completes the contract of unpaid labor for 7 years. Jacob is true to his word, putting in all 7 years, and the morning after the wedding night, he discovers he's been given a different girl, his uncle's oldest daughter, Leah, in marriage instead. Angry, he goes to complain and is met with a new bargain due to the fact that the sealing of the covenant is complete, and Jacob has no recourse that involves undoing what has occurred. Jacob is free to abandon the monogamy expectation of his covenant with God and Leah, enter into what God considers an incestuous relationship since Rachel is Leah's own sister, and take Rachel as a second wife exactly 1 week after marrying Leah, and everyone will look the other way. That is, only if he agrees to another 7 years of work after he does so. The great irony of Jacob's deceptive character being that he couldn't tell when he was being deceived himself. Jacob's flippancy and irreverence for appropriate familial relations wins the day, and he agrees to enter the girl he claims to love into an incestuous, polygamous, jealousy-ridden nightmare. This is a point in the scriptures where, if you are reading it accurately, the words that you would use to summarize it would be dumpster fire. This is a dumpster fire at every level of analysis. All right, stop. This is a good place to teach you grounding exercise number 1 for serving those undergoing deconstruction and coming to this section of the Bible. Grounding exercise number 1 is call it as it is. In the same way that we do not say to someone in a panic attack that they are overreacting, we do not call out someone looking at the scriptures like this and proclaiming that they're awful. Right? We say to them, you're not wrong. This is awful. The scriptures document a ton of awfulness. You'll notice that nowhere in this passage is God applauding this behavior. You're allowed as a Christian to call out biblical characters openly and in front of both fellow Christians and non-Christians for their atrocious conduct. I don't know where we got the idea as a Christianish culture that we needed to defend every biblical character's actions. We do not. And there is something wonderfully refreshing about a Christian who knows their Bible responding to somebody's objection with a confirmation that they're indeed reading this passage accurately. Stop defending the poor behavior of biblical characters because you're worried you need to make them more likable. Or you're worried that your loved one is going to run further from Christianity because they're grappling with the actual text and reading it correctly. If they are reading the text correctly, then confirm them. The last thing we want is to unintentionally imply that Christianity formal is somehow dismissing or taking these things lightly. It may feel like you need to, but don't. These stories are actually true, and one of the greatest miracles in the world is that out of this dumpster fire and all the insanity the rest of the Old Testament documents is a character so incredible that the world never got over his coming into it, our Jesus. And the fact that he stands in such stark contrast to this is one of the points of documenting it in the first place. Are you following me on this? So when someone says to you, "What's with all this gross polygamy sister wife stuff?" your response is, "Yeah, isn't it crazy? Jacob was a total creep." And then just let that confirmation hang in the air for a minute. Let them tell you what they need after that confirmation has been made. Just like someone having a panic attack will tell you what they need. Do not automatically jump into an exposition on how these characters also have redeeming qualities, or how polygamy might have been a vehicle for the good of expanding ancient Near Eastern populations. Please don't do that. It's not an accurate defense of this material anyway. We are not called to be apologists for Jacob. We are tasked with being apologists for our own belief about who Christ is and what he came to do. That may involve an exposition of why Jacob's story is in the Bible, but it does not involve trying to make Jacob look better than he was. Okay? All right, back to the mandrakes. The tension that has been present from the time Jacob began this mess to this point has had years to build and is now at a boiling point. Not only has the sibling rivalry become exponentially worse, but now the sisters are weaponizing their own maidservants against each other. And Jacob agrees to go along with it. Turns out that when it came to having children and building families at this point in the ancient Near East, the greatest power and goal for a woman was to produce a large family. Her self-worth would have been tied to these ends, and the way she would gauge her success in life was through these means. Leah was fertile. Rachel was not. Rachel, desperate for consolation and in competition with her more culturally successful sister, gives her maidservant to Jacob so that the culture around her, who would count any children conceived by Rachel's maidservant as Rachel's, could begin trying to salvage her self-image. Leah, not to be undone, does the same with her maidservant so that Rachel can't catch up. Leah was the unwanted spouse after all. And we have significant evidence that Jacob treated her that way through profound neglect. Her consolation was, at the very least, she could outdo her adored little sister. Thus sets the scene for our first particularly weird narrative, a back and forth between Rachel and Leah over a plant called a mandrake, a rare plant that grew in Padam Aram. That's where Jacob and his family lived. The ancients sought after these plants because local superstition said that they had aphrodisiac qualities and would help a woman conceive. Reuben, Leah's oldest son, had found some while he was harvesting wheat and brought them to his mother as a cure for her experiencing something she normally hadn't, temporary infertility. At this point, she had 4 sons of her own and 2 through her maidservant. Rachel had not had any children of her own, and so she too was seeking mandrakes to solve the problem. Rachel implores Leah for these mandrakes that have been brought to her sister. Leah responds with vitriol over her sister having stolen her husband, and now she has the audacity to seek out her mandrakes as well, and on that basis offers a deal. She'll give Rachel the mandrakes, but in return, she must send Jacob to Leah so that she might have one night with him. Rachel agrees. Leah heads off to tell Jacob the news that she has purchased his services for these plants. Jacob complies, Leah conceives, and the narrative continues through Genesis without any more explanation. So why is this story in here? It's bizarrely specific, and the author seems to think that it's an important bit of information. Is this just a rambling and random story? No, there are no throwaway texts in the Bible. And no, this passage is not evidence the Bible no longer applies to the modern mandrake-free era. Let me show you. This passage is here for a multiplicity of reasons. First and foremost, it features two women as the primary players in this chapter. God cares about the conduct of humanity. Women are not an exception, nor are they less important, nor is their sin more easily overlooked because they're women. In an ancient context where female interrelational activity was uninteresting and devalued, God makes it a feature and something he cares to highlight. That brings us to the second reason this passage is here. Putting your hope in local magical plant superstitions to solve problems will get you nowhere. There are many passages of Scripture warning the people of God against other similar practices, like astrology or sorcery, for example. We're to cast all superstitions from our lives and trust God as our sovereign, no matter what our circumstances. The fact that God shows compassion to the sister who gave away the potentially magical plant, allowing her to conceive, versus the sister who tried to rely on something other than God to give her the power to conceive, should not be missed here. You should be thinking, irony. Finally, another reason that this passage is in here is to illuminate the reader of just how bad things have gotten in a short amount of time after the initial setting of this stage. Even the victims of Laban and Jacob's agreement are now authoring heinous sin. Both women are willing to barter for relational and sexual intimacy, something that should never be traded in such a way. Leah manipulates and takes advantage of her own sister's desperation, and Rachel goes so far as to prostitute her own spouse to get what she wants. And at the end of the day, Jacob complies with all of it. He doesn't even attempt to protest the absurdity of the entire thing or to protect any of them, let alone their maidservants. All he had to say was no, and it would be over. Why is this passage here? Well, it's to teach us that the natural consequences are of ignoring God's design, his good boundaries, and our sin as it matures over time. It's to point out that there is no level of superstitious herbology that is going to get around his sovereignty, and it's to highlight his mercy that even in this nightmare, he hasn't abandoned those he calls his own in spite of their flagrant mishandling of what has been gifted to them. And if you keep reading, you're going to see that this is a theme. Over and over, God showing patience and compassion to a people who treat him with contempt and willful rejection. Well, isn't that nice, Anna? You're an apologist, and you can tie up weird and random scriptural passages into nice little boxes for us, but you're missing a critical component here. That's just your interpretation. You're coming in after the fact and forcing metrics into the Bible that were never there to begin with to try to make it all sound better than it is. There are other people that read that section and don't arrive at those conclusions at all. So we really can't know anything about whether or not that passage is in there because of what you say or because some scribe decided to ramble about nothing. Okay, stop. That's a perfect introduction to grounding technique number 2. Hermeneutics. Actually, it's not my interpretation at all. There is a formal process by which literature is assessed. The process is designed to remove the reader and all of their preconceived notions from a text in order to be able to know what the original author intended to communicate, as opposed to any agenda the reader has to interpret the text in a way that is inauthentic or false. This process is the study of interpretation, or that big word I just used, hermeneutics. The idea that the Bible is just up for grabs and no one can ever know what an accurate versus inaccurate interpretation is just straight up a bald-faced lie. It is this particular instance that there is a parallel where I see, in the case of somebody having a panic attack and they say to you, "I'm going to die," that you respond with a firm contradiction of that idea. You tell them firmly and compassionately that they are not going to die. And this is also what you do with the dismissal. That's just your interpretation. Firmly and compassionately reply that it's not just your interpretation at all. Let me show you how this works. This is an entire seminary course boiled down into just a few minutes, so hang tight, okay? What we always want to do with any text is try to get at the heart of why the person is writing and their intention for writing the way that they do. This is particularly important for the Bible in that there are two authors claimed to be present in any given text: the physical author, as well as the timeless author, God. Hence, why we refer to the Bible as an inspired word of God, even though there are lots of different human authors involved. In order to be able to do this, we have to try and pull ourselves and our preconceived modern notions out of frame so that we can get into the head of the author at the point it was written and into the mindset of God as to why it's important across time before we ever can accurately apply these notions to our own present circumstances. To do anything else would be to potentially misapply the scriptures, which is something God warns us not to do. He also warns people who call themselves teachers of his scriptures that their handling of the text will be judged doubly. It's no small thing to claim to teach what the Bible says, remember that. Correct interpretation begins with the question, how would the audience initially being given this information have received it? What was the human author's intention in putting this particular content into print? In order to do that, we study ancient context, the syntax and grammar used, what type of genre was employed, etc. All of those details matter in order to get an accurate picture of how the initial audience would have received this information. All of those details matter in that we also compare that information with other locations in the Bible referencing that same content. Once that has been secured, we move on to the second question: why would God include this particular information for all of time? What is important here to communicate to all human beings in every generation? What are the timeless principles being given here? If the timeless principles are applicable to all humans in every generation, then what we have extracted is truth itself. Theological statements and dogmas are codified at this point. And it's here, finally, that we can consider how these truths apply to us in our day. How do these principles speak into the modern era, into our specific homes, into the privacy of our own minds? Modern application comes dead last. This is so that we are practicing exegesis of the Bible, reading out of the scriptures what they actually say, regardless of how we feel about it, versus eisegesis, or reading into the scriptures whatever is convenient for us at the moment or in our specific scenario. You see, there's an actual process of interpretation. This isn't an every man for himself sort of thing. We can absolutely know for certain whether or not our interpretation is true. Because the final step to all of this is to test the interpretation with the test of synthetic unity. God does not change. Therefore, his word does not either. Therefore, anything that claims to be his word should hold up to a test of agreement in all places where that interpretation's content is discussed across the whole of Scripture. The cross-references matter. This is every cross-reference, chapter by chapter in the Bible. There are over 70,000, some of which are prophetic. The cross-references matter. This is a visual representation of the synthetic unity of the Bible, verse by verse, mapping each and every reference and its counterpart. What this demonstrates is that there is only one correct interpretation of a verse, but there are innumerable applications of that interpretation. It's holistic, meaning that even after using the hermeneutic circle, if your concluding interpretation contradicts the Bible elsewhere, your interpretation fails. And if you are genuine about maintaining synthetic unity, you will chuck that particular conclusion in the garbage and start over. That's how we know whether or not you're a genuine teacher. This is what good pastors do to prep for a sermon. In fact, that last step, the application to the modern era, is the beginning of the study of homiletics, or how to preach. All of this is interwoven, and that fact is why apologists like me can identify good churches from bad ones. It isn't that I stand up here and give you my personal preferences as a metric for warning you or encouraging you against certain specific environments. My metric isn't me. My metric is this. If the leadership cares about relating to you God's word in a way that is consistent throughout the entire scripture, and this is done both formally but also consistent with God's character, then I can recommend them as a safe mental space for you to sit under theologically. If they are not uniquely concerned with honoring the system and protecting their people from themselves and the sin that creeps in with leadership concerned with featuring themselves in the pulpit instead of God, then they go on my radar as a place I warn people about. When you sit in on a Bible study with me, you are given the hermeneutics circle to test and assess your reading by. The reason I do that is not simply because you need to know how to exegete. It's also to protect you from me. That's to give you the system by which the people of God keep the ones called by God accountable. This is why doctrine that has been codified at length by the people of God through this system is so very important to keep clear. These doctrines aren't opinions. They are the accurate representation of the God we serve and the message he has for his people about his Son. And they have been tested through the filter of synthetic unity. People who come in and attempt to overturn or reimagine material that has been confirmed at length by the people of God do so at their own peril. For the burden of synthetic unity falls onto them. There are some issues we are free to disagree about without there being consequences. But for doctrines surrounding God's character or the framework that gives us the gospel, altering those things risks teaching others to worship a God of their own imagining, which is an idol, which means that their object of faith is false, and therefore they are not saved. Again, this is not opinion. This is not an institution trying to maintain some sort of power over adherence. These things are the difference between knowing you possess spiritual life and knowing you're choosing spiritual death on an interpretive level. When theologians begin labeling certain notions as heresy or heretical, they aren't saying that the metric for that label is found in an overturning of tradition. They're saying that the heretical notion fails the filter of synthetic unity, and they're pointing at creeds and councils, the corporate acknowledgement of Christians through time, all hearing from their shepherd on said subject and arriving at the same conclusions, having read the same Bible themselves, as evidence that synthetic unity has not been met. And when theologians begin sifting and labeling notions as heresy, it's your job to run the test to see if they're correct yourself. That's how all of this works. Which is why when you get to esoteric theology, that is material that's presented to you as though you need to fulfill some protocol that's special before you can understand a teaching or before you can embrace their specific interpretation of the Bible or the world at large, you know that you are no longer dealing with Orthodox Christianity. And I know you're familiar with what I'm getting at. It's those groups or individuals that claim that they have extra special access to God in a way that you don't. Or that theological dogma is unknowable throughout the history of the church. It's the folks that say, well, you'll understand after you become more enlightened by doing X, Y, or Z, whatever it is. After you meditate in a certain way, for example, after you go through some special book study outside of the study of the Bible, after you join the group, or have demonstrated some action for long enough, etc. Guys, in camps like these that say things like, well, there's truth, but then there are deeper truths. Or they begin making nebulous suggestions that don't have any real cognitive grounding points and are uncomfortable with the suggestion that there is a correct way to understand Christianity and the nature of God, and there's an incorrect way to understand the nature of God. And then they suggest if you were to embark on a specific spiritual journey, you would also arrive at that conclusion. It's the folks that start to get nervous when you start trying to get precise. Authentic Christianity never withholds information from people wanting to test it. Christianity has also never changed the test for authentic belief. Never. And that goes for believers and unbelievers alike, which means if you're deconstructing, you will always have access to not only the information you need, but also the information that folks out there who are attempting to abuse and take advantage of folks going through a traumatic time period like what you're going through will look like. And when you see that happen, you know to run. God is interested in protecting you whether you are leaning toward rejecting him or not, and he will continue to do so, even if at your final breath you affirm that you would rather spend eternity away from him. These things that I'm describing are just a couple of many ways that you can know you're dealing with false teaching. If anyone limits your informational access to being able to test their teaching, or they refuse to comply with the synthetic unity of the Bible, then all of your red flags should go up and you should proceed with caution. This is how damaging cults are able to recruit new people so readily. They know you don't know how to test them. They withhold theological information from you until you're already a member. And they get you to become a member by targeting the folks who are the most emotionally suggestible, like the ones deconstructing. And they do this because they can act like meeting them is spontaneous, when really what they saw was your public post on social media announcing your impending departure from mainline Christianity. That's how they recruit. If you are deconstructing publicly on Instagram, I get it. You're wanting to be upfront and transparent. No problem. That's great. Just please know that there are unintended consequences to our choices, and one of yours is that you've also just made yourself bait for wolves. So if you have disavowed Christianity recently and you've done so publicly, and you're now experiencing an inordinate amount of interest from a stranger being a bit too quick to comfort you, please know that my services as Cults and New Religion Specialist is for all members of our community, not just the Christian ones. I love you. I will help you. Okay? Back to the agenda. All right. Now that you know all these things, and as budding apologists yourselves, you've been equipped with the tools to test emergent teachings that are being debated on a social level right now. Teachings like the divine counsel solution to the supernatural visions given throughout the Old and New Testaments. If you haven't heard of this yet, you absolutely will. Some of our local pastors are already taking sides in this academic debate. It's not a new debate at all. And this is not an instance of esoteric theology. It's just only ever been something folks were exposed to if they had to do a deep dive analysis into ancient Mesopotamian mythology, which most folks only ever get on a graduate level in dead languages. But because of the work of Dr. Michael Heiser, this material has been synthesized into a series of books that is marketed to the general public for what has been just long enough that it's making headway into our congregations. And I bet for a lot of you, this stuff will be brought up at Thanksgiving dinner in 9 weeks, which is why I'm shining light on this now. This is really interesting and fun material. I just don't want anybody being introduced to this material sometime in the near future to say the same thing the girl said from the Frank Turek event. This is not hidden material. This has been around for ages. I don't want anyone thinking they need to deconstruct over this. It's just that the general public has not been all that interested in the weird parts of the Bible in such a highlighted way until this whole public deconstruction movement began, which is why we're doing some of this stuff tonight. And remember that what I'm about to show you is only one of several ways to handle this material. The divine counsel framework for analysis is one of several solutions to how we are to understand the angelic realm when we get to parts of the Bible where we are given limited information for why it's there. The weird parts, like what we're talking about tonight. And what it says, essentially, is that God has a supernatural family that he created, that he interacts with regularly. A family with many members that he has given authority to rule and govern and discuss issues regarding humans over. This divine council is not actually composed of gods in a capital G sense, or in the same as Yahweh sort of sense. And they are not a pantheon of lesser gods either, meaning that we should not be imagining them in a Yahweh is Zeus and this divine council are other gods on Mount Olympus. We are to view them as beings that were created, share supernatural attributes like they don't die by getting old, and they live in a non-material realm. And they also shared human qualities, like they can appear like humans if they want to. They have free will and can choose to rebel against Yahweh if they want to. They have jobs and responsibilities overseeing mankind, and they have individual opinions about how mankind is governed. If you're familiar with Psalm 82, this is where your mind should be going. A psalm of Asaph. God stands in the assembly of El. In the midst of the gods, he renders judgment. He says, "How long will you make unjust legal decisions and show favoritism to the wicked? Defend the cause of the poor and the fatherless. Vindicate the oppressed and suffering. Rescue the poor and needy. Deliver them from the power of the wicked. They neither know nor understand. They stumble around in the dark, while all the foundations of the earth crumble. I thought you were gods, all of you are sons of the Most High, yet you will die like mortals and will fall like all the other rulers. Rise up, O God, and execute judgment on the earth, for you own all the nations. This divine counsel framework is a framework that functionally begins here and extrapolates the implications of this conversation while maintaining synthetic unity. Every time we get to a snapshot of God's throne room, in cases like Psalm 89, for instance, which asks the question, who is like the Lord among the heavenly beings? In the council of the holy ones, God is greatly feared. We see that there are beings with God interacting with him. They do not share in his unique attributes like omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience. They are limited, but limited in a way that is alternative to humans. So these beings are not gods in that they share Yahweh's attributes, but are rather supernatural in the sense that they share a plane of existence with Yahweh that we human beings do not. And so with this framework, we can begin to make sense of the glimmers that we get in the Bible that are critical to our understanding of how to make sense of our world. A world that is essentially a dual war. A war between humans who rebelled and dealing with sin, as well as a heavenly war where some of these supernatural beings have also rebelled. And we can apply this framework to yet more weird verses like the opening to the book of Job. If you apply this framework within the hermeneutic circle to the opening of the book of Job, where Satan appears before God to challenge God's assessment of Job's righteousness, you'll notice that the Hebrew context doesn't say Satan with a capital S, as in Lucifer himself, but rather a member of the divine council who is willing to accuse Job of being a fraud. In Hebrew, this accusation would read Ha-Satan, or the accusing one. Under the divine council framework, this means that this person making this accusation against Job and in the face of Yahweh is simply a member of the divine council who is reporting back to Yahweh what he has been doing, which is documenting the comings and goings of human beings across the land. And he's expressing his free will by taking issue with Yahweh's assessment of Job's righteousness. When Yahweh takes him up on his accusation, what he is doing is showing mercy to this supernatural being and all those in the heavenly host who are watching the interchange. This being has challenged Yahweh's omniscience, and instead of smiting that being right then and there, Yahweh decides instead to permit the experiment to continue so long as Job himself isn't harmed. It seems that God is interested in the heavenly host freely choosing to follow him, and to cast out a member of the council for questioning him would imply that perhaps this haughty supernatural being is correct. Yahweh then allows Job's family to be removed from the earth, which is a just and merciful thing of God to do, since death is the end to earthly pain and the beginning of joy, as well as the perfectly just end for the mortal life of a sinful human being. He then permits this supernatural family member to demonstrate just how wrong he is in front of the heavenly host. God then explains pain and suffering to Job himself so that Job does not despair permanently. And then in his good pleasure, God restores to Job everything he lost doubly for good measure. This framework applies elsewhere, as the same thing goes for odd texts in the New Testament. Texts like the bizarre way Paul brings up head coverings for women in his first letter to the Corinthians. At first, he makes a clear statement that head coverings should be an obvious thing. He then clarifies that although that's true technically, a woman's hair is her head covering, and then he concludes that he's making what looks like a stream of consciousness incoherent rant because of the angels. What's up with that? Well, under the divine council framework, and keeping in mind the hermeneutic circle, this makes total sense. The context of that letter is that Paul is writing to what was then the Las Vegas of the ancient world. No shame, no modesty. And at this time in history, it was believed that the length of a woman's hair directly correlated to her fecundity. The longer the hair, the more robust the potential pregnancy was available, as it was believed hair was the outward sign of an internal network by which sperm travels in order to conceive. So for a woman, her hair was her glory. But for a man whose purpose was to eject sperm, not draw it in, short hair was preferable. And for a man to choose to advertise with long hair that he did not desire to take his role seriously was dishonorable. But what that meant then was that hair itself was also a way to allure inappropriately, immodestly in public. And we are called as Christians not to be thusly immodest during a worship service to Yahweh. And so Paul says to the women of Corinth, who would not be culturally concerned with appearing modest, that they need to cover the thing that is equivalent to advertising fertility or fertile availability. In the same way, we today would not wear in church the same thing we might wear on a date. The Corinthian women were being asked to dress modestly. A man's eyes are easily drawn, and Paul is asking the women to reduce distraction. But what's more is that Paul's concern isn't just over the potential inappropriate cultural distraction. He's also concerned for the distraction that this poses to the supernatural realm. He cares about these women's safety. His reference to the angels is not an accident. He knew his scriptures well. His reference was to the fact that there are supernatural beings who are also visually drawn to human women. And we wouldn't want a repeat of Genesis 6. You recall the Nephilim incident. We wouldn't want a repeat of Genesis 6 where they came down and interbred with women they were attracted to. See what I mean? Understanding the different cultural contexts of ancient cultures is critical for correct assessment of the text. Being well read on what academia is discussing on scriptures that normally are not discussed widely by evangelicalism is extremely helpful for clarification, which brings us to our final grounding exercise of the evening. Helping the person having the panic attack recover and move forward. This grounding exercise is the physical practice of apologetics, what we learn at these nights, by teaching the person deconstructing how to do apologetics, teaching them hermeneutics, how interpretation is done, that interpretation is not a free-for-all of differing opinions, showing them the debates within academic circles, teaching them orthodoxy, and overall simply being transparent about how everything works, why liberty is totally fine on secondary theological issues, and then offering them the gospel. The beauty of showing them theological debate is in the details. The end results of the debate ends in exactly the same conclusion for both sides if they're believers and interested in maintaining synthetic unity. It doesn't matter which path you take. It all ends up at the same place. So theology is not taken out of here. In effect, you're showing them that in spite of there being debate over how best to understand the ancient context, it doesn't matter which path persuades you. All paths end in exactly the same conclusion. Our homiletical statements, the last part of the hermeneutic circle, they're all exactly the same. Orthodoxy is maintained. Christianity does not change. We just get more precise over time. And this is akin to the cognitive behavioral therapy that someone would receive who has regular panic attacks and wants to be rid of them. It's exposure therapy. The point is that you're showing them how to reconstruct an accurate and robust faith should they desire to do so. And if they don't desire to do so, showing them that deconstruction is the greatest gift that God could bestow upon them if he does exist. Because in so doing, our God is clearly communicating to them that they're not saved, that they do not know his son, and that the Christianity that they once believed they possessed was fake. In effect, our God is removing the false notion from the minds of those deconstructing that they are saved so that they can actually become saved in the future. And it's through this pain and processing trauma that God is speaking directly to the hearts of those in the throes of this process. That I love you, you need to know this, and I'm going to make it so apparent to you that I would rather you know and be outside of the church than be attending church services your entire life and be surprised after it's too late. Make sense? Okay. All right, let's do a couple of rapid fire applications of everything you've learned tonight to illustrate how this works and give you a bit more practice, and then we'll open it for Q&A because I've talked for way long enough, I think. All right. Remember, we're going to employ the hermeneutic circle, engaging in exegesis instead of eisegesis, and then testing with synthetic unity across the whole of the scriptures. I'm going to go quickly. It's your job to verify that I'm not making this all up. And at the end of the day, when someone says to you that no one has ever handled this material in church, you can say honestly that yes, they absolutely have, and you've witnessed it. So here we go. Case study number 1. Uzzah. 2 Samuel 6 and 1 Chronicles 13. Let me remind you of the story. The Ark of the Covenant had been seized by the Philistines in war, but the Ark is now on its way back to the Israelites. Hooray! And on its way back, the transport vehicle goes over a bump. Uzzah, who is there reaching out to stabilize the Ark, he reaches out to stabilize the Ark and is struck dead immediately. Conclusion, God loses his temper against some poor man making a reasonable move to make certain the Ark of the Covenant doesn't fall on the ground. Right? Why would God kill this guy? Is God throwing a tantrum? Applying the circle to this passage exposes what really happened. We have the Ark of the Covenant, what is the physical presence of God himself, being stored in Uzzah's house for an extended period of time. King David and his entourage, who are fully aware that this is inappropriate as there is a protocol for the movement and the storage of the Ark, become flippant in their reverence, requesting that the Ark be brought to them instead of sending the individuals who are responsible for transporting the Ark to the Ark itself. Uzzah and his brother comply by tossing what they know to be the physical presence of God in the back of an ox cart and taking off down the road. The ox inevitably stumbles, and Uzzah reaches out and physically stabilizes the Ark because he's worried it's going to fall out of the cart and onto the ground. Problem number 1. The irreverence in this story is palpable. The fact that God doesn't do anything into the final scene of this story is a crazy level of patience and mercy. Problem number 2, Uzzah loads the Ark of the Covenant onto the ox cart correctly, which means he knew what he was supposed to be doing with it. You'll notice he wasn't killed earlier for having touched it, which means he knew full well what he was doing and did the wrong thing anyway. Problem number 3, Uzzah believes that God needs him to do the steadying. The fact that when the ox stumbled, that Uzzah believed God needed his help in keeping things smooth is a huge red flag by way of his internal irreverence. And problem number 4, Uzzah believed that the Ark touching his hands would be cleaner than the Ark touching the ground. The soil of God's creation in its obedience to the Creator is not dirtier than human flesh. We are innumerably more unholy than the ground upon which Uzzah believed the Ark would come in contact with. Conclusion, God is patient even while we slap him across the face repeatedly. But there's a limit. Because God seems to restrain his hand more often than not when we sin, it's easy to forget that there is a dark day ahead for those who remain in rebellion against him. This is why it's critical that we spread the gospel. Because there comes the day when faith is no longer necessary because you're face to face with God. Atheism, after all, ceases to exist as an option when you die. Got it? Case study number 2. Onan, Genesis 38. Here's the story at first glance. Onan, who has married his brother's widow, employs the pull-out method of contraception, and in so doing, incurs God's wrath and is struck dead. There are 2 common conclusions after reading this passage. Number 1, that God is angry at attempted contraception, and 2, that even more broadly, God believes that wasting one's seed is a sin, and therefore, masturbation in general is a sin. And neither of these conclusions is even remotely close to accurate if you employ the circle. At this time in history, there is no way for a widow who has had no children to survive. She will literally starve to death. The invocation of what is called levirate marriage is thusly made. An unmarried surviving brother of the man who died is able to elect to take care of her by marrying her only if she is willing. And the result is that the first child to be conceived in the marriage is to be legally considered as the child of the man who died. This provides a permanent legal framework for inheritance as well as maintaining lineage expectations in extenuating circumstances, meaning that if both parties agree to the marriage, they're obligated to behave in a way that honors this system of inheritance. Onan agrees to a levirate marriage with Tamar and then willfully and repeatedly abuses the sexual privileges of marriage, withholding from her the very thing she agreed to this relationship to accomplish. He gratifies himself at her expense, and God will have nothing to do with that. And so after Onan is warned that he may not continue treating Tamar as his private, self-centered excuse for self-satisfaction, when he ignores God and does it anyway, God executes him for his wickedness. The moral of the story? God has zero problem intervening on behalf of his daughters. There is a line when it comes to abuse and self-centered neglect, and removing a man over this issue from the planet is not beyond the realm of possibility. You'll notice that employing the hermeneutical circle to this scenario demonstrates that this story has nothing to do with birth control in general or masturbation in general. Those things are dealt with elsewhere. See? Clarity. Last case study, and then we're going to quit. Noah's drunken nakedness in Genesis chapter 9. At some point after the flood, Noah plants a vineyard, consequently is successful at producing wine and becomes drunk. At some point after that, his son Ham stumbles upon his dad in a state of undress that is shameful, and instead of helping his dad out, instead goes and tells his brothers what he found. His brothers, acting respectfully, cover their dad up in his drunken stupor, and when Noah awakens and finds out what happened, Noah reacts bizarrely by cursing Ham's fourth son, Canaan, over his embarrassment. What? How does that make any sense? How is this not super weird and irrational and an example of why the Bible is irrelevant? If anyone should be cursed, it should be Ham, and not some poor kid who had nothing to do with the incident. And further, how is Noah's curse even remotely proportional to what happened? Well, because once again, employing the hermeneutic circle gives us a clearer picture of the details the author gives the reader in order for us to understand what occurred. When you compare the phrase, he saw the nakedness of his father, to other instances in Scripture, we find that this is an idiomatic phrase used to denote sexual intercourse, and in particular, sleeping with your father's wife. We also see several instances of this by biblical characters throughout the ancient Mesopotamian cultures, as doing this in order to signal that they were now in charge, usurping their predecessor's power and attempting to take control. Reuben, for instance, sleeps with Bilhah. David, taking Saul's wives and concubines as his own, to the chagrin of Nathan, who rebukes him for being debased. Absalom follows suit, taking all of David's wives and concubines when David leaves on campaign, and he does so in full view of the rest of the Israelites in order to signal that he's now in charge. Ham didn't happen upon a passed-out naked Noah. He stumbled upon an incapacitated father due to alcohol who couldn't defend his wife, and Ham took advantage of the situation. Once he was finished, he went to brag to his brothers that he had laid claim to the leadership of the family, and in an act that telegraphs that his brothers want to communicate that they do not share in any mutual lust for their own mother, let alone a desire to usurp authority from their dad, demonstrate care and kindness to provide dignity to their parents, who are going to have to deal with what just happened when Noah comes to. The reason Noah places the curse on Canaan is because Canaan is the vehicle by which Ham could lay claim to control of leadership. Canaan is the pregnancy that resulted from the maternal incest. Noah, in effect, is indeed punishing Ham, in that Noah obliterates any chance for Ham to be in charge ever. If the curse goes on the genetic line of Ham's incest, no matter how many generations long that lineage lasts, it will never be able to lay claim to patriarchal leadership over the rest of the family. Are you getting an idea now of how powerful these tools actually are in a culture of skepticism, as well as one of assumed confidence over the Bible, especially content that we're not familiar with, as we think we are? All right, that's it. That's way enough for tonight. Let's open up for some Q&A. Too much? Did I freak you all out? I feel like you've known me long enough that you know this is going to happen. Did you learn anything? Yeah. Okay, good. It's all right if there are no questions. I'm not going to force anything. I spoke for over an hour. I can't believe y'all sat there through that. Have you seen Divine Counsel Framework before? Okay. Here are the books. Well, some of them. If you have more questions, I can clarify. That podcast, the Naked Bible podcast, is fantastic if you're interested in how all this plays out across the scriptures. It's very fun. Heiser's a good speaker. He does this all the time. Just know that there's a little mini academic war erupting as to whether or not this is something that we start teaching from the pulpit. And groups like the Bible Project, Tim Mackey, are you familiar with those videos on YouTube? They have completely embraced the Divine Counsel Framework. Like you don't even see any of the other options. So that's why I said, well, now that it's here and people are talking about it, we have to address it completely. Like you have to get an idea of where this comes from and how to test it, because this can go way, way, way down roads that you never want to go. So if you don't have the hermeneutic circle, you can, rein it in a little bit. Let's not go crazy. Let's not start bringing the Book of Enoch to church, okay? Please. Thank you. All right, that's fine. No worries. Next time, we're going to go over demons and Halloween and hell and what it's like and why there needs to be eternal separation for people that don't want to follow Jesus. Like, why exist at all? Are there other options? Do we care? Does it matter? That's what we're going to be covering. All right. Y'all are dismissed. It's okay. It's for you. It's not for me.